When you think of the relationship between your work and church communications and the work of discipleship, what do you envision? Are you a directional sign, just pointing people to the various options at your church? Are you a link in the ministry chain, seeing your work as encouraging and enabling someone's first step closer to following Jesus? Or are you part of a cycle where the work of ministry and church communications truly help and feed into one another? This relationship is what we're talking about on today's episode of the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast. Thank you to everybody for listening. My name is Dan Wunderlich. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and our guest today is Dr. Len Wilson. Len wears many hats, including serving as the Director of Innovation and Strategy at St. Andrew UMC in Plano, Texas. He's also the Executive Director of Invite Resources, a new resource publisher that was born out of his local United Methodist Church. And if his name sounds familiar to you as it did for me, it's likely because he's a longtime blogger in the church communication space at his site, lenwilson.us. And before we jump into the interview, I'll note that we decided to break this conversation up across 2 episodes. Some themes carried throughout the whole conversation, but what we talked about in the second half really ended up feeling like it deserved to be its own episode. So today is part 1, focused on discipleship resources and church marketing. And in our next episode, we'll explore what Len identifies as the 6 traits of a great church communicator, as well as his number 1 piece of advice for us as we navigate the transition out of the pandemic and into a new normal. All right, let's jump into it. Here's part 1 with Dr. Len Wilson. Len, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
It's my honor. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're recording this just about a week or so after that incredible week of historically low temperatures in Texas and all of the challenges that came along with it. So I just want to start by asking, how are you? How's your family? How's your church doing?
Well, family and I are doing well. We had some chilly nights with the rolling power outages here, but
Yeah.
no damage to our house. But our church did sustain a little bit of damage. Some other churches in our conference, North Texas, sustained some pretty severe damage, as well as some of our parishioners as well. So it was definitely a thing. That is for sure.
Well, we are certainly thinking about you and praying for you. And even in a couple weeks when this episode comes out, I know this may have faded from other people's memories, but hopefully today's podcast is a good reminder for all of our listeners to just say an extra prayer and think about our brothers and sisters there in Texas. But Dr. Wilson, in the intro I read, you have many job titles. But before we jump into all of those things, we'd love to learn just a bit about yourself and your story in the world of church marketing and communications.
Sure. Dan, this morning I was reading on my phone. I like to start the day with a little input. So that could be scripture input, news, whatever it is. And I saw a video where they had exploded an undetonated bomb in Exeter, England this morning. If you saw this, they just had to blow up this bomb that was they discovered it in a renovation project there in Exeter. And I just thought that was interesting. Like they tried to defuse the bomb, they couldn't. And I was thinking, what a beautiful metaphor that is for the work of the church. Sometimes old wars and old scars leave bombs, and there's residual damage, and relational health and restoration sometimes requires detonating a few old bombs, and you got to deal with it safely, and that's what the Christian community is about. So, like, if you're going to talk about relational health, you can use academic language, you can use the 5 W's, as you said in your intro, or you can use an image like that. And I think images like that are so much more powerful and effective in communicating the gospel. And that little bomb thing this morning is just a little anecdote to illustrate the perspective that I try to bring to my work, and have always tried to bring to my work, whether it is in the various hats that I've worn, is just to help people understand the gospel in a more clear way through the language and the images and the means we use to communicate.
And was communication and marketing something that you studied, or did it end up just being a natural outlet for your desire to share the gospel?
Yeah, that's a great question. My goal has always been to communicate the gospel. In fact, I'm one of those kind of weird people that had a very clear picture at a young age what I wanted to do with my life. I had a kind of a calling. It was a very clear night, actually, my junior year in college. I was reading scripture, and I felt God speak to me to and I formed a mission statement out of that, was to use oral, written, and visual means to tell the story of Jesus Christ and advance God's kingdom. And wrote that down. I had no idea what it meant. Took me a long time to merge those things together into a ministry career. But yes, from the beginning, I mean, my degrees are all in communication and religious communication, and I've always looked to marry the bridge between church work and communication work, and that's taken several forms over the years. In fact, I've had basically three eras of my ministry life. One was in worship design and the use of screens in worship. I started the media ministry at Ginsburg Church in Ohio in the 90s. It was the
Oh yeah.
first stage of my career, and then taught other churches to do that. And then kind of the second era of my career was in communications marketing for the last decade. And all along I was writing, working with the Methodist Publishing House. So now this new phase in publishing is both a continuation of something I've been doing and also kind of a new era I'm moving into, which is very exciting.
Well, yeah, and we'll jump to that in a second, but I just want to say, hearing you talk about being a worship design and screens guy, like back in, 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, it had to have been kind of interesting over this last year. And we'll touch on COVID at the end, but
Sure. Yeah.
to see churches like finally catch up, maybe to something that they've been resisting or has been on their to-do list for 30 years. Was it kind of weird, or was it in some way gratifying? Like, yes, I can help resource and guide churches in something they honestly should have been doing 30 years ago.
It's funny you mentioned that, Dan, because you can look at a lot of change in the life of the church as cycles of innovation, and there's a whole theology I have behind this. But our innovations are never perfect, and so there's this weird cycle that happens where, as our innovations reach full fruition in the
Mm,
church, the seeds of their demise are already built into that.
yeah.
And that's true with screens and worship. We were, as far as I know, and I've never had anyone tell me otherwise, Ginsburg, we were the first church in our tribe to put a screen in the sanctuary.
Oh
And
wow.
I've asked someone to correct me on that because I've never heard a story since we did that in 1994. And so as far as that is, true. But yeah, I mean, it's, 20, 25, 30 years later, then screens and sanctuary, of course, are the norm. Online worship is the norm. But COVID, the seeds of its demise were there. I mean, the COVID is, in fact, I put on my social networks a couple weeks ago that the age of big event worship is done.
Mm,
We're not going to go back to that anymore because the implicit with the use of the screen, these are different things, but they were conflated. The use of the screen and the idea of worship as the first step or the front door of the person's Christian
yeah.
experience became one and the same, and that idea of a big event experience to lead people to a relationship with Christ, that's the part that won't come back.
Mm, mm. Well, I'm so tempted to jump in there, but we'll save that for the end. Let's go back to that the publishing piece of it. I would love to hear about invite resources. Honestly, I'm a local church pastor myself. I am always looking for high quality resources, and specifically from Wesleyan and Methodist voices. And we do have the United Methodist Publishing House, and we do have a couple other publishers that do publish folks from the Wesleyan and Methodist perspective. But there's always this implicit dance when one of your small group leaders or the women's ministry leaders brings you a study from, another branch of the theological tree. And while we have the same roots, we are on different branches, and we're on different branches for a reason. So I am so excited to hear about a new venture like this. How did it get started, and what is the vision for this publisher and the project in general?
The 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 senior pastor at St. Andrews named Robert Hasley, he founded the church in 1986. He's the only pastor the church has ever had. He's probably close to retirement here pretty soon. And I was actually hired by the senior associate pastor, his name is Arthur Jones, back in 2016 to help work on a contemporary service at the time. But when I first got to talk and get to know Arthur, and Arthur and I had never met, but we were 1 degree apart for many years, apparently. We both shared a common desire to resource the larger church, and from the very beginning of my time at St. Andrew, this vision and idea of what has become Invite had been out there. But of course, as you know, as all of our listeners know, the daily demands of church life can be consuming.
Yes.
So when COVID began on the first day of shelter in place, we all looked at each other and we said, okay, this is the time, let's switch it. And so I changed jobs internally at the church and began to put most of my emphasis into doing this. And the reason we're doing it is because we feel there's a great need for Wesleyan and Methodist voices that are geared towards someone kind of a lay orientation.
Mm-hmm.
Our tagline is to share the promise of the new creation. Our desire is to create interesting books. I'll tell you, Dan, my I've written several works with Abingdon over the years, and I joke that my wife has never read any of them because they're boring. And you know, she they're written for clergy. They're professional books, trade books.
Right.
You know,
Right.
how to do your job better as a church professional. And I learned a few things when I actually worked at the publishing house for a brief period, and I learned several things when I was there. One of them was that the average United Methodist pastor, at least at the time that I was on staff there, would buy 11 books a year and read two.
Mm,
I thought, okay, whether that's, you know, good intentions or whether there's a, you know, whatever that reason is there, I would also notice in my worship design work, both at the churches I served and also at other churches I consulted with, that if there was a book that enough parishioners were picking up at Costco or at Barnes and Noble, like, well, I'll name the Shack as an example of that,
right.
then all of a sudden pastors are like, I've got to address this. And they end up reading the book and they end up doing sermon series about it. And those books become just as popular, if not more popular, than anything that's designed to speak specifically to clergy. And
Yeah.
we have ended up with this kind of bifurcation, and this is so permeated throughout all of our ministry between the clergy and lay. My mentor, Len Sweet, once said that's the only tenet of the Protestant Reformation that didn't take was the priesthood of all believers. You know,
Mm,
it's we have this kind of bifurcation, which I could get off onto a tangent with you about that, Dan, but it's basically
sure.
Luther's theology of salvation and vocation that we're kind of stuck in there, and so we create these kind of stations in life. And if you're a clergy, you do clergy stuff, and if you're a layperson, you don't. And I don't think that's helpful. And I want to create works that the average layperson finds interesting, and I want them to be the kind of thing that can directly go to them to help change their lives, and not something that has to be brokered by a clergy person.
Mm,
So
mm-hmm.
that's one of the goals of Invite. So the tagline is to share the promise of the new creation. But when it comes down to it, I just want to create books that my wife wants to read.
There you go. You know, and I'm oversimplifying a bit, but you know, you leaf through the catalogs of Wesleyan and Methodist resources from various publishers, and almost all of them are repackaged sermon series, which aren't in and of themselves bad. The sermon series were created to be helpful. They're hopefully biblically based, and they ended up being something that the pastor saw as being able to be shared, but that ends up in a very formulaic, like, this is going to be a 4 chapter book, or it's going to be an 8 chapter book, or it's going to be 6 chapters, and hopefully you'll do it at Lent, or you know,
Right.
something like that. So I
Right.
guess my question is, like, what you've touched on it a bit, like, if we wanted to break that mold of what we see in page after page of all the catalogs, like, what can you give us? You mentioned the Shack, or do you have anything in mind as examples of things like, I would love to create the Methodist version of that, or a Wesleyan perspective on this conversation that's going on?
Sure. You know, it's been said, I'm not the first person to say this by any means, but we have the best theology, and sometimes it's told in the worst way. You know,
Yeah.
and you look at some of the other stuff that's out there. Like I'm thinking about the neo reform movement, you know, gospel coalition kind of stuff, and they've got beautiful packaging, don't they? They got good marketing, good
Right.
materials, and the reason is they're hitting specific needs.
Mm,
When I acquired books at Abingdon, I used to look for two types of need. I look for human need or emotional need and market need. And good works hit both of those things, and they're relevant to the time. We've got 8 to 10 books in the pipeline right now for Invite, and two of them are on race. We've got one on parenting. We've got devotional book. My book's on Christian innovation. We've got two lay theology books, one of whom by Arthur Jones. I mentioned him a second ago. Is called Solid Souls, and that's going to drop in June. And it's kind of reclaiming the idea of a soul. What is a soul? And
mm,
in
hmm.
his work, he's talking about the heart of the book's about trajectory, and it's about the idea that little decisions we make in our lives either grow our soul into a life of flourishing, which of course is another maybe a more simple way of talking about sanctification, or that shrivel our soul, you know? So that's an example of how we're taking like an idea that has been turned into an academic concept or a theological or kind of esoteric concept. And we're trying to present that in a way that's both heartfelt and relatable and very human. So that's kind of the direction of stuff we're trying to do.
That's great, and like you said, some of it is just also knowing obviously the content in itself, but just how to position it in the market and make it
Yes, man.
appealing. Some
Yes,
of the lists of things that my small group leaders are bringing to me are because they've got a really great trailer, or someone actually took the time to write the copy in the catalog in a way that actually made it seem helpful. And one of the things we fight in the church marketing world, and I find myself, I just get lazy and I turn church announcements into make plans to join us or we would love to see you at,
right.
and it ends up sort of like a when and where rather than why. And so it's nice to hear that the leader of a new publishing company is not just a theologically trained person with a heart for ministry, but they actually want to get these things in the hands of real people and get them excited about them.
Absolutely. That's 100%. You got it. That's what we're trying to do. And so positioning is a big part of it. You had talked about, and I know that the whole gist of this podcast is about marketing. And I've been thinking about Invite a lot in relationship to marketing. And we're trying to market Invite. We're trying to market all the individual titles
Right.
that we do, which is kind of bucking the industry standard, by the way. Most individual titles don't get marketing. We feel like if a title's worth publishing, we're going to spend some time marketing it and
Mm.
spend some resources to help get that out there to find its audience. Because, I mean, the Holy Spirit's working through all kinds of people in our connection. And the best thing we can do is to help connect audiences to that work, and whether that's through invite resources, or if it's through books, it's through we're going to be doing other things too, Dan, podcasts and video based resources, things like that we have in the hopper. All that's designed with the idea of connection, ultimately to lead to discipleship, as your podcast talks about.
That's awesome. Well, before we broaden out into the relationship between discipleship in general and church marketing, I know probably a couple people's radars are going up. If there are pastors or lay people out there who think, "Hey, I might have an idea for something," what kind of are you looking for? What's the a good way for someone to get in touch about potentially wanting to offer up a resource?
Sure. I'd love to talk to folks. I've never had to advertise for manuscripts, oddly enough.
Yeah. Yep.
Believe it or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you inviteresources.com is the website, and you can contact us through there, or just reach me directly at lwilson at inviteresources.com. And I'd love to have conversations with anyone that's interested.
Awesome, that's great. And I actually, and I've mentioned this before. I host another podcast on occasion that's about preaching, teaching, and communication. And I never hurt for guests because once you get on a publisher's mailing list, they keep your
That's
mailbox full of books. So that cycle just continues.
Yep.
Um, well, to open the episode, I asked our listeners to think about the relationship between church communications and discipleship. And certainly for some of us, we might have only ever thought of ourselves and our work as a megaphone or a delivery vehicle, like this study, this date and time, this location, or head to Zoom or whatever. But obviously, the busier and more burnout we get, and many of us are feeling overloaded. We already had a full plate, and then suddenly we became producers of online worship and online events.
Right.
We can all regress to that, even if we were a little bit better and sharper in our pre-pandemic days. But as a long-term church communications guy, and you're now publishing some of these resources, obviously you have a heart for the church and the ministries. You have a heart for marketing and communications. How do you understand these things working together? I guess that's a leading question. Do they work together, and if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely they do. I think it's possible to look at Jesus's ministry from the perspective of communication. And I'll use the word communication as opposed to marketing. You and I both
Yeah.
could do stuff about this, I'm sure, but marketing is still kind of a loaded word in terms of the idea of
Right.
creating markets, and I don't want people to get down a rabbit hole about you know business. So just to sidestep that, I'll talk about communication instead. But when we look at Jesus's ministry from a communication perspective, I think you can pretty neatly divide his audiences into two clear and well, maybe three if you include the Jewish leaders of the day. But you've got crowds, you've got disciples. So the primary focus of his ministry were to the crowds and to the disciples. And there's very distinct
Mm,
communication that happens to each one of those. Scripture is clear that when he was speaking to crowds, he only spoke in parable. He only used images, illustrations, stories, and even with the disciples, in Matthew 13, there's a long sequence about this. Even with the disciples, he frequently, in the majority of the time, would stick to that same communication style, and then sometimes would go through and explain in a more clear, plain spoken kind of way what he meant to say. And so you
mm.
kind of think, well, why is that? And we mentioned reform folks, and I don't want take too many shots at them, but I have
Right,
seen from
right, right.
a reform perspective, people will say, well, that's because he didn't want them to understand the gospel, and I don't agree with that.
Mm,
I think Jesus was there in order for people to understand what his message was, but he was choosing different communication styles in order to be able to speak to these two distinct audiences. It's like the Jack Nicholson line from Few Good Men. He goes, "You can't handle the truth." If you look at the Gospel of John in Jesus's last teaching with the disciples in the upper room on the week of his death, he's very clear about that. Like there's much more I wish to tell you, but you can't handle it right now.
yeah.
And so the implication of that is that Jesus had to slowly walk people through everything that he was trying to say in a way at which they were able to receive the message. And so that meant to crowds, he said one thing; to disciples, he sometimes would say another, each according to their ability to understand. And in fact, that scripture is in there clearly, like each according to
Hmm.
his
Yeah.
ability to understand. That him who has ears to hear. And for those of us who grew up in the residual philosophical worldview of the Enlightenment, we have put a lot of emphasis on reason and apologetics. And reason is pretty far down the totem pole of ways in which people process a message. In fact,
Mm,
I saw an
yeah.
article on Inc.com this morning. Next time you end up in an argument, do this instead. And the writer was basically making the same argument that we make appeals to logic and to reason, and that's most of the time pretty far down the list of things that appeal to people.
Yeah.
And Aristotle talked about pathos and ethos and logos and the various ways in which we communicate, and the pathos and the means by which we communicate are inextricably bound to the messages that we're trying to say. And when we have kind of a 5 W's approach, megaphone approach, as you were saying, we are ignoring that. We're just sending the information out, and we're making the assumption that because we have said something that people are going to hear it in the way we intended. But that's not what happens at all. People bring their own filters to something,
Right.
and they can hear something entirely different. And so effective communication is inextricably wound to discipleship, because it is the work of trying to understand the world and the life and the ears of those to whom we try to communicate, and then to position our message in such a way that they are able to hear it.
That is, and mentioning that how Jesus taught, probably the most detailed, probably the quote unquote Bible study that I know I would most want to have sat in was the post resurrection Bible study, where Jesus basically walked through the entire Old Testament and was like, "This was about me, and this is how this story worked." And
Right.
but that
Right.
none of the details in there. It's just because they knew where this gospel was going, or they anticipated what the gospel itself in the historical, time where it was going and who would read it, and that would not fit that audience. And of course, too, we know that at the same time the Holy Spirit was working on this eternal level, where it's like, it's not that this isn't important. Jesus took time to go over this with the leaders who were most ready and prepared for it, but it's also not something that needed to be in there. And then when you talk about the enlightenment and the reason, it causes us to bring different questions to the text, and so we're asking questions of the text it never intended to answer. And I think in the same way, like, we make that mistake with our congregations, we assume their questions, and then we answer the questions they don't actually have, or we give them answers that confuse them, because their questions are different. I know that was like three different things. It made sense in my head. Any
No,
thoughts or responses to that?
no, it's great. Absolutely. Yeah, I love it. Preach it. I mean, that's, my doctoral degree is in semiotics and church culture. And semiotics is the idea that there is our our intent, there is the message, and all the things that the message is wrapped up in: codes, images, context. And then there's the receiver of the message. And all those things are in constant interplay. And in the old days of communication, the emphasis was on us. It was kind of selfish, frankly. It was kind of like all
Mm,
about us. We would think about our message and we would get it out. And then the McLuhan era, if you will, the Marshall McLuhan era was like, oh, the meaning
right.
is a message. And so we began to talk about the idea that the message itself is wrapped up in these images, wrapped up in specific language, has context. And that was all educational. But what we've entered into now is an area when we're really starting to focus on the receiver. And I like to call the audience a story receiver because it's a story they've got their own interpretation of what's happening. And effective marketing is people that, and this is very true in the corporate world. And if you pay attention, of course, corporations have very different goals than we do. But if you look at some of their communication methods, they're pretty far down the road from us in many cases of paying attention to the receivers of their messages and where the receivers are and how they're processing what we're trying to say to them. And we would be wise to think through in all of our communication the context in which people live, and then to find images and words that help to bring the gospel to where they are in their context.
When perhaps on a very practical level, that's one of the ways that we as church communicators can help our discipleship ministries folks, because hopefully we know our community and our story receivers maybe better than they do. They know the people that they're currently ministering to, the people that are in the program, and they maybe have spent some time thinking about those that aren't yet a part of it. But maybe what we can do as communication professionals, or professional volunteers, is help them understand who it is we have the potential to reach, which not only helps advertise the series better, but maybe can even help them shape the program and which resources they select.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned advertising. And advertising is just a small subset of marketing.
Right.
When we
Right.
define marketing is equal to advertising, we're missing this entire thing we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And the thing is it's all local. And bookstores, for example, have learned this. Did you know Barnes and Noble? They've made a strategic decision to move away from national buyers to local buyers. So one of the things we're dealing with as Invite is I've got a little bit of history of getting some of my work into a Barnes and Noble setting, but it's all changed in the last few years since I got my last book into a
Mm-hmm.
Barnes and Noble. It used to be national buyers. So I would call a woman I know in New York City, and if she liked it, she'd buy it, and it might appear in a Barnes and Noble. It doesn't work that way anymore. Now, local and regional buyers are all making decisions based on their own context and based on their own zip codes. So there's this shift of moving to the story receiver and paying attention to not what matters nationally so much as what matters in Florida, what matters in Nashville, what matters in Dallas, and on and on. And those things are all different.
Mm. And how about the cycle back? How might the fruit and results of discipleship flow back into church communications? What are maybe some ways we can allow the success and wins and growth and discipleship areas to help us do our work?
Well, ultimately, it's about story, not data. When we communicate, Dan, and stories of changed lives are the most effective communication means we have at our disposal. When I've worked with both staff and volunteer folks at St. Andrew, one of the things I've told them over the years is if you want to communicate something, show me the fruit, not the seed. Show me the result of the ministry. If you can give me a story of someone whose life was changed as a result of the ministry you're doing, then that's golden. We can take that and go all day long with it in terms of how we're communicating. But that's a challenge because then if you say that to someone, you're actually
Yeah.
suggesting that there actually is fruit to their ministry. And so I've been a part of many uncomfortable conversations about that. But
Yeah.
that's the thing. I mean, so if you can find stories of life change, then that's the best way we have to communicate with people because it's about art, not data.
And that's where part one of my conversation with Dr. Len Wilson ends. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so that you get part two as soon as it releases. In the second half of our conversation, Len shares what he sees as the 6 traits of a great church communicator, as well as his number one piece of advice for us as we navigate our way out of the pandemic and into a new normal. You don't want to miss it. Now, listeners, we want to hear from you. What kinds of resources or discipleship opportunities drive the most engagement within your church? Have you found a way to turn something like a new small group or a Bible study into a way to connect with those outside your church? Email us at podcast@umcom.org. And you can, of course, use that email, podcast@umcom.org, to send us any feedback or topic suggestions you have for the show. We always love hearing from you. And as always, the easiest way to support the show and help other church communicators like yourself find it is by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues and by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever service you're listening to right now. And did you know that United Methodist Communications is celebrating 80 years of ministry? Your support ensures that the latest denominational news, dynamic stories, and informative articles will continue to connect our global community. Make a tax-deductible donation today at resourceumc.org/giveumcom. That's resourceumc.org/GIVEUMCOM. Thanks again for listening to the MyCom Church Marketing